Okay, today we are going to go over a list of things that I wish I had known when I started doing fly photography or macro photography a number of years ago. I will get to all those and I'll show you exactly how to do them.
Dude, that's a big brown.
All right, so I've been shooting fly photography now about 15 years, and I've had an evolution over time of gear, techniques, computer editing software, different things like that. And so what I'm going to go over today is a list of things that I'd wished I had known when I started out. And bear in mind that we're going to focus mostly on not iPhone or not point and shoot kind of camera considerations. So this is a mirrorless camera. It's a full frame camera. So we're not talking about how to make do with an iPhone. I do have a video on that if you want to look that up. We talk about some of the things, but this is, if you are seriously wanting to get into fly photography, whether you're just posting on Insta or whether you do like I did, and that was published to fly tying catalogs, fly fishing, fly tying magazines. There are some techniques that you need to know to bump up your photo game, okay? So we're gonna go over those. First off, we're just gonna talk at a high level what we're gonna do. First off, we're gonna go over the gear, kind of the setup and the techniques that I'm gonna use. Next, we'll jump into an actual setup of shooting a fly, adjusting the lighting, some of the settings on the camera. And then finally, we'll go into Lightroom and I will show you exactly how I edit the flies, the end photography product. And again, we're talking things that you might want to blow up to have a framed photo or something like that. Anything that could be in a catalog or a magazine, or anything that you want just to really pop and be sharp and have true colors and as clean as possible. A lot of times people just do this for the hobby aspect, and which is how I started, and that's kind of where I got to where I am. So over the years, I've learned all these tips and tricks. But again, we're going to talk about some of the, let's call it high-end gear, but you can get this type of gear at a much lower price point. So let's just start off talking about the camera. What I've got here is a Sony Alpha 1. This is a full frame mirrorless camera. It's a couple, 3 years old. This is by far my favorite piece of fishing gear. And I mean that, above rods and reels, because I got to take me some photos. So I've also, along with this, I have a number of lenses that I can use for macro photography, but my favorite is the Sony FE 2.8 90mm macro lens. So this is a lens that pairs with this full frame camera body. If you were to say, hey, I want to do a higher end camera setup and I want to get a nice lens, then I would recommend find any, let's say mirrorless would be my suggestion, Sony, Canon, Nikon, whatever, and find one, a body. It could even be a crop sensor versus full frame. If you're not sure what that is, Google that. Depending on what you can afford, I guarantee you can find some good camera bodies in the $300 to $500 range, kind of for starting out. And then along with the lens, the starter lens that I recommend to a lot of people is a Tamron 100mm macro lens. It's very inexpensive. I think it's a couple $100. So realistically, $500 to $600, and you've got a really killer setup. Now this is the bread and butter of your macro or fly photography setup. This is a relatively higher end setup. I wouldn't necessarily go out and buy this if I were just a hobbyist, but we do make our living from the flies, and so this is what I use. Now, the reason with a full frame lens or full frame camera and this lens, you get a lot more light capture. So what that means is you get more detail in the photos, you get less noise, and you can shoot under variable conditions. So in a studio like this, we have lighting, we have a light box, and some other things that we can control. That doesn't become as important, but if you messed up a setting, let's say on the exposure, it does give you some forgiveness having a full frame. So you can work with lighting settings and you can tweak the photos a lot more. So you have more room for error. Good thing is, the more you practice, the better you're gonna get at dialing all those settings in, and the photos will be nice. But at a minimum, you do wanna get something that can shoot either full frame or crop sensor with a legit macro lens. All right, so let's talk a little bit about what a macro lens is versus just any old lens that you could put on your camera. So first and foremost, the macro lens will give you one-to-one magnification. That means what the photo sensor captures is the actual size of the subject. So if you've got a fly, it's going to take a photo that will be legit to size. It's not going to zoom it. And what that does for you, as opposed to say your iPhone, is it will give you a lot more detail. Now, when you're taking pictures of really, really small things, that is very important. Like you can take a picture with the cell phone and be kind of far away and zoom in, but you're going to lose a lot of detail. So first and foremost, anytime you want to photograph bugs or flies or anything small like that, having a macro lens that's designated as a macro lens and designed as a macro lens is very important. So that would be tops on my list. Again, you can get these for a lot of different price points. Now, the other thing that you can do because of that is that you're so zoomed in, you can really dial in the amount of detail, you can tweak the colors, you can mess around with all the settings, which we'll go over when I'm actually shooting the fly. But again, you have a lot more flexibility. You can, if you need to zoom out, you just move the camera back. If you need to zoom in, you move the camera forward. That's essentially the way that a prime lens would work. So it's a fixed focal length. This is 90 millimeter. One of the reasons why I like a 90 or 100 millimeter versus say a 40 or a 50 is that I don't have to be as close to the subject. I can be a little bit further away. Gives me some leeway when I'm shooting bigger flies. I can adjust where they sit in the setup and I have in my light box. And it also allows me to fit more flies in. I can back out. Anyway, I think it's a lot more flexible when you have a slightly longer focal length lens. That's just me. All right, now in addition to the lens, again, the camera body is one of those that becomes very important because there's going to be some features that you will really need to take advantage of on these digital cameras especially. And one of the biggest things that say over pre-digital, let's say, would be your ability to review and zoom in on the photo after you've taken it. So, and as I show you, I'll do that. I kind of review them, but it also allows me to really dial in the focus. Now, as I show you, I do macro photography most always with manual focus. Sometimes I'll do an autofocus if I'm out in the field, and there's some other settings that the Sony has that make it kind of nice that it can actually follow a fly as it's flying in the air or a bug. But in a studio kind of set setting, you don't need anything to be chasing around. And by far the best way to get sharp focus would be manual focus. And there's a setting on Sony and other cameras that have to help you see where your focus point is so that you can make sure that eye of the hook is going to be tack sharp. So beyond that, and again, some settings, we're just talking about this is the bread and butter of your gear. A couple of other things that I would really highly recommend that you invest in. Second from the camera would be a really good tripod. I like a hefty tripod that's not going to shake or rattle. You would be surprised, especially if you're in like a second story of a home or an office building. There will be some movement. Somebody's walking by down the hall or something like that, that you want a tripod that's not going to shake if the floor shakes. So I like a hefty tripod. If you're finding that it's not very stable, you can always hang some metal or something from it to get it so that it's just rock solid and not going to move. Now, going along with that, and with any macro type photography, because you're in there so tight, you need to have as minimal movement as you can, both of the fly but also of the camera. So what that means is the camera I need to be sitting there and I don't want to touch it when I'm taking the photo. So even if it's on the tripod, the fact that I come in and if I were to push the button with my finger, I've now moved the camera. So very important is a nice little remote trigger, doodad, remote control. These are fairly universal, but you can get some with a cord on them. They're a little cheaper, but still they're only like 20 bucks. This is key. If you're doing macro photography, you want to not touch the target and you don't want to touch your equipment. So hands off, remote trigger, that will ensure the least amount of shake, the tightest and tackiest sharp photos that you can get. Okay, so those are kind of your must-have tools to use. Now let's talk about backgrounds and light boxes. So what we have here is a sample light box. We've got a couple of these kicking around that we use. A light box is a way for you to feed light, and these are pre-lit. You go on Amazon and search up light box, you'll have a billion options. They're not that expensive. I do like the kind that will have lights on the top and then lights on the sides. And and as you'll see with my setup that we'll go through in here in a sec, I like to put some sort of diffusing material in front of those lights because they are too bright. And I like to turn down the brightness as low as the lights will go. One of the effects of having a light box like this is the light's going to bounce around in that box, which is great because it diffuses the light and it takes off any harsh glare or shine from your fly or the surfaces, but it also can overload and your camera may get a different light setting, so the fly could be blown out while your background is correctly exposed. Anyway, so I like that, but I like to keep the lighting as low key as possible inside of the light box. So light boxes are very important, but also just as important would be the surfaces that you put your flies on. And I had another video we talked about this. If you just go to Home Depot or Lowe's or any hardware store, they're gonna have piles of these free fly background surfaces for you to use. You literally just go in the store and you grab them and you walk out, and they're samples for that purpose. That's why they made them. And some of the cooler ones that I like is a piece of tile. This is white. It's got a little bit of a shiny surface. I have a black one, and that works out nicely. But honestly, my favorite one, because it shows the colors of the flies best, and it's easier to shoot, it's easier to work through exposure settings, and that is a piece of matte black tile of some sort. You can get this off of Amazon. A lot of times they will come with the light box. So anything black matte, again, to get rid of the glare if you don't like the glare. If you do, like I said, I have one of these tile pieces that I can use and you get a little bit of a reflection effect, which can be nice from time to time. But this is my favorite piece of foreground, and this is a surface that I will set the flies on. And then the background, you typically want to match. So if I'm doing a white foreground or where the fly sits, I probably want the background to be white. Most of the light boxes will also have different backdrop colors. And as I'll show you here as we get set up, you want a little bit of separation from that background backdrop between where your fly is, the camera, the fly, and then that background. You don't want your fly right up next to the background because that won't blur the background enough and it will start to be distracting. So we want to have decent spacing between these, but these are the types of things that I'll use, and I'll show you a couple of other tips and tricks as we go through the process. So once you've got the gear and everything set up, probably the next thing you're going to want to know is what settings do you do, how do you take the photo, and then lighting and different things like that come into play, all the different parameters that are associated with actually shooting a photo of a fly. All right, folks, there you have it. That is A to Z on what you need to know to take catalog or display quality fly photos from your own devices. If you have any questions, drop a comment in the link below. Ask us anything you want, send us a message, and we'll try to comment and help you out. But good luck getting your flies to turn out, and enjoy this, what I think is a great aspect of our hobby, and have fun taking pictures of flies and bugs. All right, so like I said, we're going to first do a quick tour of the light box setup. So as you can see here, we've got a light box, and this one I leave here on this desk the whole time. I've kind of customized it a little bit. I've taken off one of the side panels because I like getting, if there is some natural light, I like getting that in here. You'll notice also I've added some more fabric to diffuse the lights, and I just set that and kind of adhere it to the top so that it really just covers up this whole light. And same thing on the other side. There are some lights up above, but those are diffused enough. And then the controls on these lights, I've set them at the lowest power possible, because now, as you can kind of see, there's not any really bright lights in there where the fly is, and so that kind of diffuses everything. Now I'm going to give you a little secret tip that not a lot of people know about, but I think is a very cool feature. So in this light box, I use that black matte tile that I was telling you about, but you'll also notice I've got a little fly puck with this loon magnet, bench magnet in there. What I use that for is to prop up my plate, but also it serves as a fly steadier. So you can actually get flies to sit super steady, super still. So what you have here is now that magnet's going to be underneath,
And if your fly were ever wanting to just tip over, as soon as you find where that magnet is, the fly will stand up on end. And the nice thing is you can do that with a variety of things. We got this little hopper here. That one's a little more difficult, but anyway, so you get the idea. You can prop up flies, small nymphs. It works really good. You can get them to stand up. I bet if you put a couple in there and a magnet above, you could get it to levitate. Anyway, so lots of stuff that you can do there. But by and large, this is the setup that we use. I've got, like I said, the black background in there, the black base of the foreground, where we're going to take the photo of the fly. So the way I'm going to set this up is, again, my lens is going to be in full manual mode. So there's zero focusing that the camera will do on its own. And then what I tend to like to do, just depending on the fly, is get that in the frame that I want. And now with Sony's, everybody's gonna be a little different how they do that, but when I'm in manual mode and I start to focus, it's now going into kind of the focus magnification mode. I don't even know what they call it, but that's what I call it. And the thing I will always key on is the eye of the hook and maybe the bead. And so now we're just going to twist our focus ring. And in Sony, well, you can change this, but I use red as the peak focus color. So anything that's bright red, and you can kind of see how that changes, is going to be what's most in focus. And I want that centered around basically the eye of the hook. And if I punch it in again, it will give me even closer, and then I can just make sure that that focus peaking is right maximized on the eye of the hook. Okay, now, as far as camera settings, I have aperture priority. I've got my exposure set at 0. Now, if I were shooting a lot of black against black, you may need to bump up your exposure by a stop or two. But actually, the way this lighting is set up here, it's made so that it is exactly right for black background and foreground, and then the black fly has some red in it. Anything with chartreuse or like fluorescent orange, you'll probably need to tweak either the white balance or the exposure before you take these photos. And now I'm set at ISO 125 because, again, this is not moving. As long as I don't touch it and nothing's shaking anything, the ISO isn't going to matter. I want this fast, and lower ISO is going to translate to less noise. And when you blow things up like a macro, you can see the noise. And then I usually shoot around anywhere from a 5.6 to an 11 aperture setting, depending again on the fly color and the orientation. If I throw more than 1 or 2 or 3 flies in there, I'm going to open or close that down. I should say a little bit more so I can get more focal plane. But for right now at 9, it's going to get a decent amount of the fly, and obviously the hook point where I've focused, the peak focus there, so I make sure I got the most important part of the fly that's in focus. Now, another little trick that you can do, I won't show you exactly because it's a little bit more complicated, but it's a thing called focus stacking. So let's say that I did have another fly back in the back and I wanted that thing to be in focus too. So rather than have to shut or open up your aperture or close it down depending on how you're going to shoot it, but again, if you want more focal focusing plane, then you need to shut down your aperture so that focus is further out and a little bit longer focus plane or wider. We don't want that because we want the settings as they are. So what you can do is you can take a photo at this setting and then tweak the focus ring, take another photo without moving anything, and then even take another photo so you can start to create multiple photos of different focus points. Then what you'll do is, and you can do this, Google it up, there are tutorials all over the place in Photoshop, or there's some other apps for it. You can smush those photos together and it will render one photo with everything in focus. So that is a huge thing if you're ever going to shoot flies and you want multiple flies in there, or you have some funky stuff going on. It's called focus stacking. Google it. I'm not going to show you how it all works, but trust me, it's a cool little trick to do on macro photography. All right, so now we've got our fly here. I've got my fancy remote. And again, if I were to have anything moving, like my dog over here, I wait for that to stop. Okay, everything's set up now. I've got my settings right. It looks visually like I want it to. And now I simply just take my little remote, take a photo. It's going to review it. And then Sony has this cool feature that allows you to magnify, most cameras do, the subject. And then the thing that I check for is just to see if that eye of the hook is in focus. If it's not in focus, I'll trash it and I'll do it again. A lot of times when you're dealing with this little bit of tweaking on the focus points, you're going to have to shoot a couple of times, just depending on what you're doing. Now, another thing to keep in mind here is, now while it may be a little bit easier to get the fly, if you're shooting it perpendicular, so in other words, the fly is directly sideways, you lose a little bit of depth. I'm not a big fan of taking photos of flies like that, so I typically like to just tweak them a little bit, not fully crazy angle, but this helps to kind of draw the focus to where you want the user's eyes to go. And on that case, again, with most flies, you're talking the eye of the hook or the bead. And so you can mess around. What I normally do if I'm a little unsure on any of the lighting, I'll go ahead and take a shot. I may bump up or down the ISO. I could open or close the aperture a bit, and I could mess with the exposure. Worst case, you have 10 or 12 extra images, and then you can kind of take your pick in post and see what you want to edit. But that gives you some options to know, different angles and different lighting situations that you may want to do and mess around with. Now, again, you can go and grab, any sort of surface that you want to throw and mix and match depending on the flies you're doing. Another little trick is I've got some magnets and a piece of tippet, 7X, and that way I can suspend flies from the ceiling. You just simply Photoshop out the little tippet, and now it looks like your fly is free floating in the air. So there's a little tips and techniques that you can work on as you start to take pictures of your flies. Okay, so now you've gone through, you've taken all the pictures, and you want to get this thing onto your computer, crop it, edit it, whatever you need to do. The idea would be that you get good enough when just looking at how this one's framed, it's probably going to be good to go. I likely don't need to edit it, but I will show you some things here, and I'll kind of walk you through my whole editing workflow that will take this photo that we've just taken to the point where I would either post it on a website, or if we wanted to blow it up into a big photo, we could do that. So we'll move on to the computer part of it and kind of wrap this thing up.
Okay, so we have our handy little leech pattern, and I've imported it into Lightroom here. Now, you don't have to use Lightroom. You can use whatever editing software you would like. I've kind of landed on Lightroom because I've done Photoshop for years, PaintShop Pro, and a couple others. Lightroom is, I think, for photo touch-ups. We're not talking like fancy image manipulation. We were just doing some simple photo editing. Lightroom works great. Anyway, so we have that in our workspace here. And the first thing I tend to do would be just to crop down the image if I need to. With macro stuff, you will likely need to crop, especially for smaller flies. This one actually doesn't need a ton of cropping, but we'll just go ahead and do a little bit. It's also important to keep in mind where you're going to put this. If it's something like Facebook or Instagram, you may want more of the vertical setup. So orientation, 16:9. So anyway, we've done that. Then I usually start with exposure, and this one to me seems a little dark. So if I wanted to, I could just grab my exposure slider and just kind of bump that up. You'll notice, however, as I bump that up, the foreground's great. The background now gets a little distracting, and you can see more of those little artifacts in front of the fly. So rather than just bump up the whole photo, the whole image exposure, we're going to mask. I find with flies especially, masking is vital because there's going to be some things you want to add and adjust that are not going to happen across the board for the whole pattern. So what we're going to do is go ahead and click our mask menu item on the right or wherever you have it. And then the AI behind the masking with especially Lightroom and Photoshop has gotten extremely good. So I'll typically just hit the subject, and now it's going to go in and determine what the fly is. And it's actually pretty accurate. So you can see there, we've gone ahead and masked the fly. Now, if I wanted to, just so to kind of show you what I mean, we can now bring the exposure up of the fly itself, and be a little careful. We don't want the tail, that becomes a little distracting. Okay, so we can kind of pull that down a titch, but overall that's pretty good. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to add another mask, and we're going to take down the exposure everywhere else. So you can do this a couple different ways. If you wanted to just do brush strokes, because I want to sort of fade these marabou fibers in the back because they're a little distracting, I might do like a linear mask. So we'll go ahead and do a couple of linear masks. I think those tend to do well with fly or bug photography. So we're just going to do one linear mask, and I'm going to come from the top left down, and we'll pull that exposure down a titch. Now you can see that those little tips of the marabou are going to disappear. We'll pull down the blacks a little, get a little bit more melting into the background. And then I will go ahead and do one other linear gradient on the bottom. And this kind of serves two purposes. It can also help to clean up that foreground, which doesn't look super great. It's got some dust particles and other crap in there. But you'll notice as we start to pull this down, those will get eaten up a little bit, and we can pull the blacks down a titch. Now it's starting to look a lot better. I'm going to go back to my first mask, which is the fly itself. And on that one, I think I can draw a little bit more light out. That looks a little better. And then if your white balance is off, temperature is another one you may want to adjust. That it actually looks true to color here, so I'm not going to mess with that. And then really the only other thing that I'll do, depending on the photo, is I may denoise the entire photo. So to do that, I will come back to the main edit screen, and you can go ahead and select the denoise. Now the denoise takes a little bit of time, so I'm not going to do it here, but you would simply click that, kind of choose the settings you want, and then that's going to get that to the point where all the little noise particles in the background are going to be taken care of. Now a couple of other little housekeeping things you may want to do. I'm going to go to the healing tool and just simply come around here and blot out these annoying dust particles. And then you're also going to notice some stray hairs. Obviously we're dealing with flies that kind of have their own mind of their own, but we could, for instance, come up on this guy. It's a little distracting. Nuke that one, and it's not working so great. Let's try the clone option. Yeah, a little better, still not great. And there's a big piece of crud here, this white one. I'm not going to mess around with that too much. And then there's this guy right here. And then if you need to, you can obviously zoom in a little if you wanted to nuke some of these little fragments here. You don't need to get too crazy about it, but definitely some options just to give a little more clean look and feel to the fly. And yeah, this one here is kind of garbage, so I'm going to get that one again. All right, a couple more here. Okay, so we've got a lot of those little dust particles picked up. Yeah, I'm always finding more. Again, it's probably not a huge deal. And there we go. So at an editing level, it's very simple. We'd go ahead and export this, and you're set. So again, doesn't have to be too complex, but you typically may need to adjust exposure. You'll probably need to crop, and you may need to color correct. Auto white balance can kill you sometimes. So if you need to just change the temperature of the fly of the photo there to get you more of a true to color. And you just have to look at the fly and kind of see what you're screening. Anyway, so that's the editing part of it. If you did want to focus stack, which I mentioned before, you can do that in Photoshop. If you just Google photo stacking or focus stacking in Google, YouTube, there'll be tons of videos with 2 or 3 different software options, or if you're a Photoshop, Adobe kind of person, you can actually do the focus stacking in Photoshop. It does a pretty good job with flies, actually. We don't need to do it here because we have what we want in focus, and everything else kind of comes along for the ride. All right, so there you go. There's the editing part of it, and you are now a pro.